We're back. I'm pleased to say joined for the first time by Nolan Peterson, a former combat veteran with the Joint Special Operations Command, Air Force Special Operator, pilot, and man with service in both Iraq and in Afghanistan. Today he is a foreign correspondent for the Daily Signal. His beat is Ukraine, which is where we catch up with him. Nolan, welcome. Thank you for your past service to our country and that you are rendering in your current incarnation. Great to have you with us for the first time.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Look, you've been filing a number of troubling, but I'm afraid all too accurate reports about what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. We've been led to believe that there's a ceasefire in place, that things are sort of under control. The danger of a wider war has been tamped down. Is that the truth, or is that basically spin that we've been receiving from others besides your good self?
Well, from my firsthand experiences out in the front lines, the ceasefire is a fiction. I just recently returned from 8 days embedded with the regular Ukrainian army, and I was one of the first foreign journalists to be allowed to do that with the regular army. And it was 8 days of what I could only describe as just total hell. It was a constant artillery fire, snipers, machine gun, automatic grenade launchers being fired pretty much around the clock. And it felt like a state-on-state major war out there. It is geographically contained to the front lines, which the front lines are about 200 miles long in eastern Ukraine. But the fighting is very serious, it's very real, and it's extraordinarily intense. I was a pilot in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've seen combat before, but I'd never seen anything like this. And I think it's just surprising that this type of combat is ongoing in Europe in 2015, and is generating very little mainstream media coverage.
It is stunning. Let me just ask you, to what extent is the intensity of the conflict that you're seeing a function of direct Russian involvement in it, as best you can tell?
Right. Well, obviously we're on the front lines. I can only report on the things I see. So there's no, you don't see them waving Russian flags on the other side of nothing going out there. But I think there's certain, besides the reports you see all the time about satellite images, catching things and all that, from my vantage point, from being on the front lines and in the trenches with the Ukrainian soldiers, you see indications that the combined Russian separatist side has professional soldiers fighting for them. For example, there are drone operations going on where the tanks are coordinating with drone ops, which is a very sophisticated maneuver to call. Also, just the sheer volume of artillery being fired. There's heavy artillery shells being shot at least every 10 minutes, 24 hours a day. So just the amount of funding it would take to maintain that level of firing, it just indicates that there's some serious financing and some training going on the other side.
Yeah. And describe the condition of the Ukrainian forces. They have, of course, not received the assistance that they've long sought, most especially from the United States, but I guess from others as well. Is there really much of a capacity on their part to contend with the kind of firepower and combat capabilities that the Russians, as you've indicated, are evidently bringing to bear on behalf of the so-called separatists?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a strange situation out there because the Ukrainians are pretty well equipped with old surplus Soviet equipment. You have a lot of AKs, Kalashnikovs, anti-tank missiles from the Soviet Union era. But at the same time, the most basic things like food, uniforms, first aid kits, body armor, all that comes from civilian volunteers who quite literally drive these things out to the front lines in bullet-ridden minivans. So the Ukrainian army is giving their troops the basic essentials with which to fight, but as far as supplies to sustain that effort, they're completely dependent on civilian volunteers. Now, they're equipped with weapons to fight as things exist now. If there was an actual full-on Russian invasion with air power and more sophisticated weapons, I think the Ukrainian army would not be able to withstand that, based on what I've seen. But as far as things go now, they're able to hold their positions based on what they have.
But not liberate their country from these guys, that's for sure. Nolan Peterson is our guest. He is a combat veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, in which he flew operations for our Air Force Special Forces as part of Joint Special Operations Command. Today he is a foreign correspondent for a very, very valuable online publication, The Daily Signal. Let me ask you, in the environment you're in, Nolan, and you're seeing this up close and personal, as they say, there is, it appears, increasing reason to believe that the lack of serious pushback, even reporting, let alone pushback, from the West is perhaps emboldening Vladimir Putin to believe that a similar kind of campaign could be mounted elsewhere in the so-called near abroad, namely the Baltic states, perhaps, Moldova maybe. What is your assessment of that likelihood? Is that a real danger? Are we seeing, either out of the Europeans or the United States, anything remotely sufficient to deter it?
Right. Well, I had the opportunity to embed with a U.S. Army convoy that went through the Baltics from Estonia down to Latvia, Lithuania, and into Poland. And as we traveled through those countries, literally the roads were lined for miles, hundreds of miles, with people waving American flags. And as we would stop at the villages, the local people would come up and want to meet the troops. And they'd always, the common refrain was, "Thank you for being here. We're so afraid of a Russian invasion." And so I think throughout the region, there's a very real fear among many of the post-Soviet countries that Russia could overstep and try to do something similar like they're doing in Ukraine with one of these Baltic or Eastern European nations. Now, the danger with the Baltics and Poland is that those are NATO countries, and General Breedlove, who's the commander of NATO, has already stated that if Russia tries anything like they're doing in Ukraine in a NATO country, it'll be Article 5, and that means war between Russia and NATO, and that's a very serious, very scary thing to consider. Especially since Russia's tactical doctrine calls for the preemptive use of nuclear weapons.
I wanted to ask you about that, Nolan Peterson, because this is something that is very troubling, both in its own right and against the backdrop of the very serious buildup, including in Crimea, of nuclear capabilities by the Russians and simultaneous decline in nuclear deterrent capabilities on the part of the United States in Europe and elsewhere. Again, you're a man with actual military experience, looking at this not just through a reporter's lens, but from the perspective of somebody who's got, to assess these things militarily. How serious is that a threat do you believe those sort of contentions by the Putin government are?
Well, I see most of the deployment of the nuclear-capable weapons throughout the region. I see it as mainly posturing by Russia. However, every day you see Russian airplanes getting really close to NATO countries out there over the English Channel and in the Baltics.
Including ours.
And you see, including ours, very, very true. And you see both sides conducting massive military exercises. And what I really worry about is who's going to be that Franz Ferdinand. When is that unexpected event, when those two fighter jets collide, or when somebody misperceives a military exercise for an actual attack? So I think
miscalculations abound.
Exactly, are building up their forces in the region. Tensions are growing and growing, and it just takes one false step, that one thing that nobody can anticipate, that could launch us into World War III. And I think people have to take that seriously. I'm telling you, I just saw artillery bombardments in eastern Ukraine. It's real. It's already happening. There's already a war in Europe.
Nolan, we have to leave it at that, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for your time and for your expertise, as well as what you're rendering in the way of real-time reporting on a problem that, as you said, is not getting nearly the kind of attention from the press, or for that matter from our government, that it requires. Keep it up. Come back to us again soon if you would, please. And in the meantime, stay safe. Next up, California activist Joe Gazzardi joins us to talk about sanctuary cities and the immigration disaster here at home. Straight ahead.